Edward startled awake. He sat there for a moment to catch his breath from the sudden emotional jolt of what he had just witnessed. Another nightmare. The old engine took a moment to reflect, locking eyes with the almost blinding light emitted by the morning sun that shined through the shed window. It had been nearly 6 months since the Second World War had been declared over, and yet even though all the fighting was over, the last 5.5 years weighed on his mind. Many had died, and much of the world's infrastructure had been destroyed, including Sodor. Edward began to reflect deeper, and as he did, a somber look crossed his face, not for the destruction of infrastructure, but for Winston. He remembered the exact date, April 10th, 1941. He remembered hearing the sounds of the air raid sirens. He remembered how he and Winston ran, scared for their lives. He remembered the sound of the explosion from behind him as his wheels just barely left the rails of the Vickerstown Bridge. He remembered the feeling of dread and shock he felt when he didn't see his friend trailing behind him. As Edward thought harder and longer about this, he began to cry. Putting aside the fact that he felt as though his age was starting to catch up to him. But now, a fair portion of his home was damaged and or destroyed, and he had lost one of his best friends, someone he had known since before coming to Sodor. In Edward's mind, everything was falling apart. He felt as though he had lost so much, and he was beginning to lose hope. Hello, old friend. It's been a long time. Edward continued to look down at his buffers. He didn't want to look up. He was afraid to look up. He recognized that voice. He knew who it belonged to, and he knew that he shouldn't have been hearing it. After a moment, Edward finally looked up, and he stared on in disbelief. He knew what he was seeing couldn't have been right. He knew that it was impossible. This couldn't be possible. He could remember it very clearly. He could see it in his nightmares. He remembered seeing his friend's lifeless, empty shell being lifted from the wreckage of the explosion, and seeing it being taken away on a flat car. He had seen his friend dead. And yet here he was, staring at him, speaking to him. In his confusion, the old engine simply muttered, "Winston?" The red engine gave a soft smile. "It really is good to see you again, Edward." But how?" Edward asked, still in complete disbelief. I thought you were dead." "Only my physical form, Edward. The rest of me is still very much alive." "Oh, I see," said Edward, still a little confused. "How have you been, old friend?" "Well, death is a very complicated thing to describe, but I've been very happy and peaceful here, Edward." Edward smiled at his old friend. It was good to know that at least he was happy, wherever he was. "How have you been, Edward?" the red engine asked. Edward paused for a moment. There were a multitude of answers he could have gave to that question. However, he chose the easy answer. "Well, now that the war is over, I'm I've been all right." Winston looked on at his old friend. He had known Edward for many decades. He knew Edward since before both of them came to Sodor. And he knew that his best friend wasn't entirely telling the truth. "Edward, I've known you for many years. You don't have to lie to me." Edward paused for a moment. He looked down, and then back up at Winston. He didn't see the point in continuing to lie to his friend. "Well, if I'm being truthful, I don't really know. I don't really know how to describe how I feel. I feel all sorts of emotions at once, it feels like. I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm confused. It hasn't been easy to deal with everything. I thought that the end of the war would bring about the end of the nightmares, but if anything, they've continued to get worse and worse since the war has ended. However, at the same time, I know that the other engines need someone that they can confide in these moments. I mean, they all witness most of the same things I did. And I don't want them to feel alone, but I think in doing that, I think that's resulted in me feeling completely alone. And the worst part of it all is I don't really know how to deal with all of this at once." Winston continued to look on at his old friend. He didn't say anything. He sat and he listened. He knew that Edward needed somebody there. He knew that he didn't have anybody there. There was silence upon the shed for a moment before Winston finally spoke up. "How do you feel now that you've told me all this?" "Strangely relieved," Edward said, a tad shaken up. Silence fell upon the sheds once again for a moment, until Winston once again spoke up. "Edward, I know that it feels like all hope is gone. I know it feels like everything is destroyed. I know that it feels like everything is lost. And you have every right to feel like this. However, something to remember is that although it may feel like everything is all wrong, it will not feel like that forever. Over time, things will improve, and everything will start to feel right again. However, this unfortunately means we have to go through dark periods. They make us appreciate the good things we do have once we have them again." Winston paused. He could see that Edward looked a little unsure, so he continued. "Do you remember many years back when the bigger engines started coming to the island, and you were left in the shed for a long time? Remember how you thought you would never be able to pull trains again, that you would never be used again? But one day, you were let out. You pulled a train again. And just like that, everything was just right again. You had to go through a particularly depressing experience, all to end up experiencing and enjoying the pleasures of life once again." Edward pondered. He couldn't deny that it made sense, although he still wasn't 100% sure about everything. For the first time in what felt like ages, Edward gave a genuine smile. "Thank you, old friend. Wherever you are, I will always remember this." Winston smiled back at his old friend. "That's what friends are for, Edward." With that, Winston began to exit the shed. "Goodbye, old friend." "This isn't goodbye, Edward. It's only one end."